Order, please. Before we begin the daily routine, the subject for this evening's late debate was submitted by the Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview. Be resolved, this government immediately make public its transportation and public works priority list for secondary road projects. Be debated this evening at 6 p.m. Begin the daily routine presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to inform the House that this government will increase Nova Scotia's minimum wage rate this year, October 1, and again on April 1, 2004. The rate will raise 25 cents each time to a total of $6.50 per hour.
Hear, hear.
The increase, Mr. Speaker, will benefit those who need it most by raising their gross yearly income by about $520. This is more than 8% increase, Mr. Speaker, or more than 4% per year. and that's keeping ahead of inflation, which was about 3% in 2002. And it's almost twice as much as the average increase for collective bargaining agreements last year, which was 2.3%. As you can see, Mr. Speaker, we are implementing a fair and appropriate increase that's putting more money into the hands of 16,000 Nova Scotians. Minimum wage increases particularly benefit employees in regions heavily dependent on agriculture, tourism, and the hospitality industries. The increase to our minimum wage rate will help contribute to Nova Scotia's prosperity and will keep the minimum wage competitive with those of other Atlantic provinces. In fact, this increase now makes Nova Scotia's minimum wage rate the highest in Atlantic Canada.
Here.
And brings it much closer to the Canadian provincial average, which is $6.56 per hour.
Here.
As you know, Mr. Speaker, a review of the minimum wage rate is required every year through the province's Labour Standards Code. It has been our practice to announce an increase well in advance in order to give businesses time to prepare for the change. Over the summer, we will be reaching out to all registered businesses in the province to ensure they are aware and ready to implement the increase come October 1. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the Minister for supplying us with this statement in a very timely way, and it's well appreciated. And we also appreciate finally he's starting to listen to us, albeit that it's an election year. You know, Mr. Speaker, for my 5 years in this House, the two successive governments that I've had to face in this House is telling them about the inadequacies of the minimum wage and how it disaffects many Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. There's many Nova Scotians out there living below the poverty line, but yet it takes an election year before this government will act. We know the 10 cent, and 10 cent stuff, Mr. Speaker. We know that these people will not be available, they will not make themselves available for the tax refund, or they will not be paying, they will not be getting anything from this government by way of a tax reduction, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians working at the minimum wage level, Mr. Speaker, are finding themselves falling further and further behind. And that's true, Mr. Speaker. And the minister says, no, they're not. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. We have. Mr. Speaker, one thing I found out in many years of collective bargaining, 10% of nothing is still 10% of nothing. Mr. Speaker, when you use percentage increases on the lowest possible wages, they're not catching up, Mr. Speaker. The reality is these people are falling further behind. Another major part of this is why don't we depoliticize how minimum wage is done? Why is it done behind closed doors? Why isn't it done in a more open process, Mr. Speaker? These are the things the Nova Scotians want, Mr. Speaker. They want to know these things. How are these arrived at? So, Mr. Speaker, so these are important issues. So, Mr. Speaker, if this government really wants to help low-income, low-wage-earning Nova Scotians, they would come here with a package of reforms to the Labour Standards Code, Mr. Speaker, that would respect, such as we introduced, that would respect workers in this province, that they would be allowed to have a 40-hour work week instead of a 48-hour work week, Mr. Speaker. Those are some of the changes. That we would appreciate what's going on in working families, Mr. Speaker, that they would be allowed to have days off or compassionate leave. These are the things that Nova Scotians don't want, not a false little promise before an election. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, the current minimum wage in Nova Scotia is $6 an hour for the experienced, and for the inexperienced, $5. And I have to get my glasses on to read this small figure. $5.55. 555. Those are the current minimum wages in Nova Scotia, not these announcements that we've heard here today. These came into effect on October the 1st, 2002. Whoops. That's when they came into effect, and I just got this copy from the printer. I wanted to make sure the printer's ink on it was dry before I brought it over here to the House.
Don't hold it too high.
But since I've tabled or read from it, I think I shall table it if the printer's ink is dry. That is the current minimum wage in Nova Scotia. Now, what we've been told is that these wages that I've just read out will be raised on October the 1st coming, and also on April the 1st, 2004, which I hasten to remind you is 1 year away. And that's when these wages will come into effect. Not today, not before the election, and not in the near future. So what we've heard here again is an expression of future intent, sort of like the Emperor Constantine, who wouldn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed because he didn't want to sin thereafter. And so that was an insurance policy against divine fire. So let's get back to modern times and away from the Emperor Constantine. This minimum wage increase, it's stated, will affect employment in agriculture, tourism, and the hospitality industry. Well, Mr. Speaker, what I say is that this minimum wage increase will affect about 20,000 workers out of 450,000 workers in all of Nova Scotia. So it affects less than 5% of the workforce. Of that 20,000 people, Mr. Speaker, they're not farmers, tourists, and hospitality types so much. 75% of them are high school and university students. That's where they're from. And the other 25% are mostly single parents. So that's the wage group that are targeted by this announcement, and not the agricultural industry at all. Sir, I say that these raises do not cover the cost of Tory government. They do not cover the Tory fees on gasoline, on insurance jackings, on registering of motor vehicles, which they said directly, of wear and tear of your car on the poor roads that they're responsible for. Yes, sir, we welcome the announcement. But the sad fact is that it doesn't even come close to covering the costs of Tory government. And as a final wind-up, Mr. Speaker, I looked through this document. I won't read from it, so I won't table it, but you know what it is? There was no section in that document about labor. There was no section in that document about workers' compensation. So we cannot commend the government for having kept its election promises last time. In this area, they didn't make it.
Thank you. Thank you. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Medmire Inc., a medical biotechnology company that employs about 40 people in its research and manufacturing facilities in the HRM, has received the approval of the Drug Administration of the People's Republic of China to distribute its 3-minute Mirrorwell rapid HIV test kits in that country, and whereas that country has already ordered 250,000 kits and is expected that the company will receive additional distribution agreements for China shortly, and whereas last month Medmire signed a deal to supply 1 million Mirrorwell triple test units for the diagnostic testing of HIV, hepatitis B, and C test kits to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Medmire on their success in the People's Republic of China, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and their continued market success in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Indonesia, Greece, Kenya, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Hong Kong, and their contribution to and commercial success in the global healthcare community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and pass without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Speaker, I'm presenting this resolution on behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Tourism and Culture. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister of Tourism and Culture attended a federal, provincial, territorial, cultural, and heritage ministers' meeting in Ottawa, and whereas, among other issues, the ministers discussed the importance of our historic places and cultural diversity, opportunities associated with culture and heritage, tourism, and the links between culture and health. And whereas the next Nova Scotian next year, Nova Scotia will host the Federal, Provincial, Territorial, Cultural, and Heritage Ministers meeting. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of the host recognize the cooperative efforts of the federal government and all of the provinces and territories in developing and preserving culture and heritage for the entire country. And Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction to bills. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act, to provide for the appointment of a consumer advocate.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act, to provide for the appointment of a consumer advocate.
Bill 33, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 380, the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act, to provide for the appointment of a consumer advocate.
Order this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice of motion. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Insurance Bureau of Canada blames skyrocketing auto insurance rates on the increase in number and cost of paying out claims for soft tissue injuries, and whereas a recent report of the Canadian Institute of Health Information, CIHI, indicates that accident rates in Nova Scotia are decreasing and that we have the second lowest rate of hospitalizations in Canada related to motor vehicle collisions, and whereas Nova Scotians have great difficulty matching CIHI's information with the uncorroborated claims of the insurance industry and its underwriting practices, therefore, be it resolved that in light of the falling accident rates, the lower hospitalizations due to motor vehicle accidents, the host asks the Insurance Bureau of Canada to revisit its claim that soft tissue injury awards are driving skyrocketing insurance rate increases in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage with it.
All those in favour say aye. Aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that NDP applause. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Martin and Eileen McKinnon of 6278 Yukon Street, Halifax, make the following suggestion with reference to Premier Ham's Vote Me $155 payment. And whereas the McKinnon suggestion is that taxpayers receiving this payment should donate it on to the Liberal Party, so that there can be some real change in Nova Scotia when the election is called. And whereas if only 1/4 of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party's 21,000 members do this, it will put $800,000 into the Liberal Party's election fund, which is far more than the NDP can scrape up out of the long-suffering unions of Ontario. Resolved that Martin and Eileen McKinnon be commended for their timely suggestion. Given the insistence of this government on political mischief, it will put the money to better use than anywhere else. Maybe we could have waiver of notice on that.
Was there a request for waiver? Request for waiver? Here, no. No is the table. The honourable order, please. The honourable member Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today, and there are 3 resolutions, and I would request a moment of silence at the end of the 3rd resolution.
So the honourable members are requesting the consideration of the House to allow for 3 resolutions to be read one after another, and then for a moment of silence at the end for all 3. Is that right? Agreed? Honourable member Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a former member of this chamber, Mr. William Bill Campbell, passed away yesterday at the age of 83, and whereas a member of the constituency of Colchester North from 1978 to 1981, Mr. Campbell not only served the people of the area provincially, he also served municipality as well as a county councillor for Colchester County and municipal warden from 1970 to 1973. And whereas this former member served proudly as a member of our country's military from 1939, retiring from service in 1969 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Following service overseas during the Second World War and in peacetime, postings in Canada, England, and the Middle East. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House, through the Speaker, express our sympathies to his wife Enid and family and the loss of a friend to the community, province, and country, and salute him for his exemplary service which lasted a lifetime.
There was a request for waiver on that
Yes,
notice.
Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and pass without debate.
All in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this House yesterday lost a former member of the Stanfield administration, Mr. Thomas McQueen, and whereas a member in the Progressive Conservative government between the years of 1967 and 1970, Mr. McQueen served the people of his community of Pictou East faithfully. And whereas Mr. McQueen, who was a retired fisherman and farmer and a great source of inspiration and guidance to myself and so many others, also served as a volunteer in his church, his party, and the health community. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the many contributions of Mr. McQueen, thank him for his loyal service to this House and his community, and extend through the Speaker the condolences of the members of this House to his family on their loss. And I, too, will be seeking waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Eastern Shore.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Oyster marked a somber occasion yesterday with the addition of the name of Private Nathan L. Smith to the community cenotaph, and whereas Private Smith perished in a friendly fire artillery incident in Afghanistan 1 year ago next week, where Canadian troops were deployed to assist the United States in the war on terrorism.
Hear, hear.
And whereas the plaque on the cenotaph in honor of Private Smith reads, "His life in defense of our freedom, lest we forget." Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this legislature reflect upon the valiant actions of Private Nathan Smith while in service to his country, and remember him not only for his accomplishments to all Nova Scotians, but to all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. I ask all members to rise now for a moment of silence in memory of Mr. Bill Campbell, Mr. Thomas McQueen, and Private Nathan Smith. Thank you. Please be seated. Now, we'll ensure that the families of the members are notified of the proceedings here today in the House. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Royal Canadian Legion John Bernard Croak, BC, Branch 3 in Gleis Bay is a very active with a burgeoning membership, and whereas Branch 3's membership has grown by almost 1/3 in the last year, thanks to the dedicated efforts of Billy Wilson, chair of the John Bernard Croak, BC Membership Committee. And whereas, in tribute to his incredible work, the Legion's Nova Scotia Nunavut Command has named him winner of its membership recruitment program for 2002. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Billy Wilson of the Royal Canadian Legion, John Bernard Croak, VC Branch 3 in Glace Bay, for winning the Legion's Nova Scotia Nunavut Command membership recruitment program, knowing Branch 3 has a bright future with dedicated members like him. I seek waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas two sure signs of spring are spring elections and the growth of tulips, and the increase in oil rig population in Halifax Harbour. And whereas another oil and gas rig has joined the two at Woodside in what seems to be a large-scale effort to search for gas and oil in Halifax Harbour. And whereas until Halifax Harbour clean-up, there's a good possibility that the only oil in Halifax Harbour is the slick which rises to the surface from abandoned oil drums. Therefore, be it resolved that the number of oil rigs in Halifax Harbour does not indicate a boom in the offshore, and that government should encourage companies to search for oil and gas on the high seas and not in Halifax Harbour. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
For waiver, I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Chebucto.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on November 1st, 2002, the leader of the third party made front-page headlines when he criticized the former Liberal government's decision to apply harsh financial assessment rules to every nursing home resident. And whereas on April 9th, 2003, that same leader of the third party made page 3 headlines when he rushed to Province House to criticize and dissociate himself from the former Liberal government's P3 financing of schools. Therefore, be it resolved that this House eagerly anticipates the page 5 headlines the third party leader will win for himself the next time he reminds people that Liberal government was a disaster for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without delay.
I hear several noes. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the caring for those most vulnerable has reached an all-time low when this Tory government allowed residents in RRSS small options homes to be moved back into institutional settings, and whereas this will no doubt have a huge impact on the quality of life for the residents and their families. And whereas the Minister of Community Services could have avoided a strike if he had chosen to accept any of the options suggested by the workers. Therefore, it be resolved that this Minister of Community Services be held accountable for his decision and the uncaring attitude of this Tory government. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver, please.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? Here are several noes. Noes is tabled. The honourable member for King North.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas two planks and a Passion Theatre in Canning were founded in 1992 by husband and wife team Ken Schwartz and Chris O'Neill, and whereas the theatre's Ross Centre for the Arts has recently received $850,000 from Cultural Spaces Canada program, and whereas the money will go towards renovating existing buildings, creating new facilities, and purchasing new equipment for the centre, which has for the second year in a row expanded its summer arts camp program. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Ken Schwartz, Chris O'Neill, and the staff of the Two Planks and a Passion Theatre for their hard work and dedication to the arts in Nova Scotia, and wish them much success in the future. I request waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas group home counsellors walk the picket line today because this government underfunds their employer to the point it cannot meet their reasonable request for wage parity with equivalent workers in the healthcare sector, and whereas the residents of group homes have been dispersed to other locations, including the Nova Scotia Hospital, and whereas the province pays the replacement workers for the residents now housed at the Nova Scotia Hospital the very rates that their group home counterparts are pounding the pavement to get. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Community Services recognize that caregivers, regardless of the institution or organization that employs them, should receive equal pay for equal work, and to achieve that for group home counselors, he must fund the Regional Residential Service Society appropriately. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Waiver here, no. Notice tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas it has been nearly 30 years since the Eskasoni Highway was last upgraded, and whereas during this period considerable development has taken place, particularly in the communities of Northside, East Bay, and Eskasoni, therefore be it resolved that the Minister of Transportation and Public Works commit to a repaving and upgrading of the Eskasoni Highway.
Notice is tabled. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the King's Edgehill Boys Varsity Hockey Team recently won the Nova Scotia AAA High School Hockey Championship in Antigonish with a 3-1 victory over the Riverview Redmen, and whereas Ryan Knowles of Avondale played a tremendous game and led the tournament in scoring with 9 goals, including 1 in the championship game, while also collecting 6 assists for 15 points. And whereas the victory capped an astonishing 2002-2003 high school hockey season for King's Edgehill, as they won 50 of their 57 games played, therefore be it resolved that MLAs in this legislature applaud the efforts of Coach Chris Strickey and the King's Edgehill High School boys hockey team on their win, and also wish the team every success as 16 players from the team will return to school for the 2003-2004 hockey season. And Mr. Speaker, I will move for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the machinery and workings of our federal government are often a mystery to many people, and whereas Forum of Young Canadians bring students from across Canada each year to the nation's capital to be introduced to government institutions such as the House of Commons, the Senate, the Supreme Court, among other important and interesting governmental processes. And whereas Mr. Luke McClellan of Knoll Shore and Miss Ilona Corbin of Upper Rawdon, honor student with distinction at Hants North Rural High, were accepted by forums of young Canadians to travel to Ottawa this month to see how government works. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly commends students like Luke McClellan and Ilona Corbin of Hants North Rural High School for being chosen by the Forum of Young Canadians to visit the federal seat of government in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, request waiver notice and passage without debate.
Waivers it agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government has consistently turned its back on the people of Nova Scotia, and whereas this government's approach is best epitomized in its peculiar rejection of Nova Scotians in favor of the British rock group called Jesus Jones, and whereas Jesus may well have walked on water, but this government is about to walk the plank. Resolved that the upcoming election should be viewed as a plebiscite on the question: do we want Nova Scotia as represented by the Liberal Party, or do we want Jesus Jones as represented by the Hamites?
Notice is tabled. The honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas North Sydney's Brandon Crane skated his way to the podium at the Canadian Age Class Short Track Speed Skating Championships last week in Montreal, and whereas the 14-year-old won a bronze medal in the 500-meter class for juvenile males, and whereas Brandon set a new Nova Scotia record with a time of 46.87 seconds, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in expressing our congratulations to Brandon Crane on his excellent showing at the Canadian Age Class Short Track Speed Skating Championships and wish him continued success in his athletic endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage of the debate.
Request for waivers it agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Tantallon Post Office has been expanded to meet the needs of the growing community within its area, whereas the postal workers at the Tantallon Post Office continue to provide quality service, and whereas this new expanded post office serves as a focal point for this growing community, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate and thank the workers at the Tantallon Post Office for their valuable service with best wishes on their expanded service. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Monday, April the 7th of this week, the Provincial Justice Minister, MLA for Truro Bible Hill, the MLA for Cumberland South, and the MLA for the Eastern Shore met with the Federal Solicitor General in Ottawa. And whereas the Nova Scotia delegation requested and encouraged the Federal Solicitor General to place the catastrophic $1 billion boondoggle known as the Firearms Act in moratorium, and whereas at the very least the federal Liberals in Ottawa should immediately scrap the long gun registry component of the Federal Firearms Act, therefore be it resolved that this legislature commends the Nova Scotia MLAs for taking time out of their very busy schedule and traveling to Ottawa to further advance Nova Scotia's position against the Federal Firearms Act, the $1 billion boondoggle, Mr. Speaker, and I request waiver of notice.
Question for waivers is agreed. I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the provincial government has declared adult learning a priority for Nova Scotia. Whereas the high school equivalency program for adult learners at St. Paul's Resource Centre in Spryfield has been closed due to a lack of funding. And whereas a very successful business program for adults at J.L. Ilsley High School was terminated despite the efforts of many groups in the community who recognized its great value. Therefore, be it resolved, the Minister of Education honor this government's commitment to adult learning as a priority by reopening the business program for adults at J.L. Ilsley High School and by supporting the GED programs at St. Paul's Resource Centre. And I seek waiver of notice.
Question for waiver. I hear a no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the P3 method of school financing brought in by the Liberals was an unmitigated disaster from conception to demise, and Liberal leader Danny Graham, got his name wrong, Danny Graham has said never again will Liberals pursue it. Whereas the Department of Education states that 33 P3 schools amassed costs overrun of $27 million without including figures for the first 6 P3 schools, and community access has been severely limited. Whereas in spite of his own Liberals' opposition and all the evidence to the contrary, the member for Cape Breton West stated yesterday that he recommends P3 as a process second to none, an innovative way to provide infrastructure. Therefore, be it resolved that the member from Cape Breton West be applauded for his support for P3 school process as a way second to none to show Liberal confusion and lack of cohesion, and an innovative way to highlight differences between his Liberals leader and those of the caucus. I ask for a waiver and passage.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The resolution is way too long. No, he will not repeat it. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas J.L. Ilsley High School recently announced the launching of its Just Live It, Be Active program, and whereas the parents, youth, and community representatives have been working hard to identify ways to involve the entire community in physical activities, whereas Just Live It, Be Active will provide innovative ways to enhance a healthy and active lifestyle for the J.L. Ilsley High School community.
Therefore, be resolved, the House of Assembly congratulate Vice Principal Linda Lund, Area Coordinator Mary Angela Monroe, and J.L. Leslie High School student Casey Malone for the Just Live It, Be Active project to promote physical activity in their community, and I seek waiver of notice.
Question for waivers, is agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Annapolis.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Annapolis Valley Exhibition was honoured late last year by the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture for being an outstanding example of an agricultural fair in this province. Whereas the Federation presented its 2002 Agricultural Awareness Award to the exhibition's Board of Directors and President Robert Noble, representing the Annapolis County Federation of Agriculture. And whereas the Annapolis County Federation of Agriculture Executive Member Darlene Denhan paid tribute to people such as exhibition executive member Anthony Van Oostrom and all members of the executives for working so hard to ensure the exhibition keeps growing while maintaining an old-fashioned flavor to it each and every year. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this House of Assembly applaud the efforts of the Annapolis Valley Exhibitions Board of Directors and wish them continued success in staging one of Nova Scotia's most favorite and best exhibitions each and every year in Lawrencetown. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteer organizations such as fire brigades and search and rescue units are vital to the well-being of our communities, and whereas an ability to contact the members of such emergency organizations in an expedient and professional manner greatly adds to the effectiveness of their response. And whereas Ms. Colleen Nisseth, former dispatch operator and the voice of the Shuby Dispatch, gave many long and selfless hours professionally relaying emergency messages from distraught callers to the appropriate authorities above and beyond the terms of her employment and call of duty. Therefore, be resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Colleen Nesseth's outstanding contribution to the safety and well-being of Hants East and surrounding residents as a volunteer dispatch operator and her example of professionalism for all emergency dispatch personnel. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day or questions put by members. Question period will begin at 12:44 and at 1:44. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
It's really 45. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
12:45.
Mr. Speaker, Calvin Williams is 68 years old. Last year, his insurance jumped by 239%. It went from $1,100 to $4,000. Mr. Williams says it's getting too expensive to live in Nova Scotia, and he says he's considering moving. Last year, Mr. Speaker, we called for an independent consumers advocate to protect the rights of Nova Scotians, and we've reintroduced that bill today. I'd like to ask the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance premiums, why won't you guarantee Nova Scotians, and in particular seniors, an independent consumers advocate who will act on the hundreds of complaints that your government has received?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to preempt myself, but however I'm going to, and to tell the honourable member opposite that we will be doing so tomorrow morning.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking to the legislation that gives the consumer advocate their legislative ability to do this and not some consulting role that the minister has described before. It's important to understand, Mr. Speaker, how unfair skyrocketing insurance rates are to Nova Scotians and in particular to seniors. On average, the Superintendent of Insurance receives 130 complaints of all types on insurance over a year. But in the 4 months leading up to February 2002, the superintendent had recorded 500 complaints regarding auto insurance alone. The majority of those complaints were made by seniors. So my question to the minister responsible for skyrocketing auto insurance is this. Your department has known for more than a year that seniors and others were demanding action on auto insurance. Why did you ignore this flood of complaints for a year before taking action?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, au contraire, actually last February, 12 months ago, 14 months ago now, we initiated a call to the UARB.
No, we did that.
Order, please. Order, please. All minister.
Why did David say no?
Order. Order, please. All minister of Environment and Labor has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said, in February of 2002, we initiated a process whereby the UARB would examine the rates for auto insurance. That's 14 months ago.
I will leave the official opposition on your final supplementary.
Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister who thinks that auto insurance premiums are dictated by flat roads also seems to think that it was their side of the House that made the recommendation to go to the UARB, when in fact, Mr. Speaker, that suggestion came from this side of the House. Mr. Speaker, the complaints are skyrocketing just the same way the rates are skyrocketing, and this government keeps talking about a plan but fails to introduce one. While they stall, Nova Scotians' concerns go unanswered. They haven't even hired their own consultant to begin this process. Mr. Speaker, complaints are piling up. My question for the minister is, when will the government bring in a plan for auto insurance in Nova Scotia?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear. When the consultation process, which is presently ongoing, comes to an end, which is around about May the 15th, I believe, shortly after that, Mr. Speaker, we'll be taking the consensus of the views of Nova Scotians and translating that into action.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. According to provincial documents received last week and corrections that have been issued again this week, it would appear the federal government has given the province $120 million this year to fund health care. But what these documents, Mr. Speaker, fail to show is that the current minister's predecessor also signed a federal health agreement in the year 2000, and I'd like to table this document, Mr. Speaker. In this document, it states that Nova Scotia will get an additional $20 million this current year, this 2003-2004, for health through the CHST. So we've gone, Mr. Speaker, you talk about accountability and good accounting practices and transparency. We've gone reporting the federal monies coming in for health care this year from $105 million to $120 million, and now we find it's actually $140 million, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister here today stand in her place and confirm that the amount of new provincial dollars is only a mere $300,000? A total of $104 million, 0.3, and 104 federal monies coming in. This province has only put $300,000 new money in the health care this year. Will the minister confirm that?
Au contraire, Mr. Speaker.
We need better researchers.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the new money from Ottawa, if according to Liberal calculations, money given in the year 2000 was new money, which it isn't, then, Mr. Speaker, it's no wonder some of them are still advocating P3 schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, that's a real comedy act. For a minister that failed at Ottawa and her seat in Ottawa and had nothing to say, and she's apparently had nothing to say at a provincial cabinet seat either, Mr. Speaker, because she's failed here as well. And she can make light of it, and she can speak in several languages, but she's speaking with a forked tongue is what she's speaking with. So, Mr. Speaker, we have $300,000 compared to, look at the $68 million that's going into the $155 check. Very interesting, Mr. Speaker. Cold reality is that here in Nova Scotia, the people in Nova Scotia would rather have an open emergency room in their community than a $155 check. You go and ask them and you'll find out. So getting that, this minister, Mr. Speaker, failed in getting a needs-based funding for Nova Scotians at the federal table while the Northwest Territories and Yukon succeeded. My question to the minister, will this minister now admit that she's also a failure at the provincial cabinet table in getting new provincial dollars for health care, a mere $300,000?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the biggest comedy act in here today is to have the members opposite defending a Liberal government that puts less than 18% of the health care money into a $2 billion budget in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that minister is not only speaking with a forked tongue, she's misleading the House.
Order.
The federal government.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Y'all members, microphone is off. Order, please. Y'all. Y'all member for Dartmouth East. Comments are, in my mind, are bridging on parliamentary. I'd ask the member to retract that last statement and put a supplementary question, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Just say sorry and ask your question.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I will retract my comment about misleading the House. But she has misinformation that she's bringing to the House. The federal government puts far more than 12 or 18%, and she knows it. It's got to do on tax points. It's got to do. So one thing has become crystal clear, Mr. Speaker, that this government pleading and begging to Ottawa for more money, it wasn't about health care at all, Mr. Speaker. It was about a tax scheme. And that's a fact, Mr. Speaker. And the Deputy Premier knows as well, and don't look amazed. My question to the Minister, will the Minister please admit that the $155 rebate check was more important to her and her government than making a provincial investment in health care, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the provincial investment in health care is more than 80% of the total health care budget. And Mr. Speaker, every province agrees on that figure. A committee of prominent Canadians, Commissioner Romano, etc., including a lot of prominent Liberals locally, agree with that figure, Mr. Premier, and I would suggest that the member opposite pay attention to some of the people in his own party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment and Labour. The Minister knows the invaluable role played by volunteer firefighters in communities right across this province. These volunteers spend countless hours in a wide variety of community service roles. So it comes as a shock to learn that the insurance industry has set its sights on the volunteer fire departments. The Port Hastings volunteers have just had a scare they don't need. Their insurance company told them that it would not provide liability insurance coverage for the fire hall. So my question for the minister is this: when will the minister tell this House what his government intends to do to make sure the liability insurance is available for volunteer fire departments?
Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
What is the government doing about the situation with volunteer fire departments and liability insurance, Mr. Speaker? Well, yesterday or the day before, I forget which day it was, but I think it was probably yesterday, the fire marshal met with a number of fire departments who are having problems and has made suitable arrangements for liability insurance for those fire departments.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's no exaggeration to say that volunteer fire departments are the backbone of many Nova Scotia communities, especially our rural communities. We all know how hard they have worked to be ready when their neighbors need them. There is no better example of people helping people than in a volunteer fire department. Fortunately for Port Hastings, they were able to obtain their insurance from another company. They won't have to close the fire hall. But here's the rub, Mr. Speaker. The premium has increased by 100%. So my question for the minister is, what plan does your government have to make sure that volunteer fire departments have affordable liability insurance coverage for their fire halls?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, this government doesn't need any preaching from the member opposite with regard to looking after volunteer firefighters. I can assure the honourable member that this government has done more for volunteer firefighters than any preceding government that I'm aware of over the last 20 years. Mr. Speaker, volunteer firefighters are the backbone of all of the communities outside of the urban areas where they have professional firefighting. Mr. Speaker, they are the spark plugs that make things happen, and I can assure you that this government has not and will not neglect volunteer firefighters in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is amusing and even sometimes entertaining, but I just wish he'd answer a question. That would be the operative thing to do. They were good enough to introduce our bill to support volunteer firefighters. They can't bring out anything of their own. Mr. Speaker, we are told that fewer people are volunteering, and no wonder. When they sign up for community service and they get slapped in the face by skyrocketing insurance premium increases for their community fire hall. Volunteer firefighters are an essential community asset who deserve and who need your support on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I ask the minister this: why won't your government do for the volunteer firefighters of this province what it has already done for some social services agencies and provide liability insurance coverage?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to the question from the honourable member, and he started off his preface by remarking that the government was stealing, evidently, the platform of the new Democratic Party. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you offhand, we intend to win the next election, and if we adopted the platform that this crowd across the road's got, we certainly would not win the election.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture and Marketing. Mr. Speaker, earlier in the week, the Minister announced a crop insurance program for the agricultural community of Nova Scotia. Concern was raised by the Executive Director, Mr. Lawrence Nason, that the agricultural community was not consulted. My question to the Minister is, why did he pursue making an announcement without consulting the agricultural community?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Au contraire, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they were consulted. In fact, some number of months ago, he was involved in meetings. This is something that they were aware of. I think perhaps what's happened is some confusion about the new program that's being talked about in terms of enhanced insurance, crop insurance coverage, and the existing program, Mr. Speaker.
Now, Member Cape Breton West, on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Nason publicly indicated that the agricultural community was not consulted. The Federation of Agriculture represents one of the single largest stakeholders in this province, and there's little or no reason why he would make such a statement if it were not true. So my question to the minister is, why is he being so arrogant towards the Federation of Agriculture on this vital issue?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I think maybe what's happening here is there's some confusion about the current program and the agricultural policy framework and the discussions around an enhanced, expanded insurance program. The current program is one that has been in place. There is a structure whereby the industry does have consultation with members of the department before those decisions are undertaken.
Honourable Member Cape Breton West, on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Nason, on behalf of the Federation of Agriculture, appeared before one of our legislative committees only weeks ago complaining about the lack of consultation AgriPoint and indeed the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture and Marketing. So my question quite simply is, why is the minister trying to mislead this House into having people of Nova Scotia believe that he consulted with the Federation of Agriculture, when in fact they are simply saying that he did not?
That's right.
No, Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, nationally, we are undertaking the development of an agricultural policy framework. The discussions around that policy are the most extensive in the history of the agriculture industry in Canada. Mr. Speaker, there have been comprehensive and inclusive discussions with the industry and with the various sectors.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the residents of West Main Street in Kentville have had their homes devastated by recent flooding. Now, it's been nearly 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, and Murray Martin's basement is still flooded. What's worse, Mr. Speaker, is the flood knocked over his oil tank and has made his house uninhabitable. The smell of oil has permeated everything his family owns. Mr. Martin has just learned the disaster relief funding offered he and the other affected residents will only cover $50,000 in cleanup costs. So my question is to the minister responsible for the EMO, what are you going to do today to ensure that residents whose houses were devastated by this flood will be provided with enough disaster relief to rebuild their lives?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. It certainly is an issue that is causing concern amongst many Nova Scotians who have suffered during this disaster. The federal program is set up to ensure that the residents who have suffered losses, that their homes can be repaired to the extent that the homes then become habitable. This is not an insurance policy or a compensation plan. It's to try to get them back into their homes. And all issues related to the eligibility of those claims will be reviewed by the committee, and those decisions will be forthcoming soon. I think it may be somewhat premature, Mr. Speaker. It may be somewhat premature, Mr. Speaker, to single out particular issues because, in fact, the evaluation of the eligible costs has not yet been completed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, oil and water have filled Mr. Martin's basement for almost 2 weeks. There is a sheen of oil on virtually everything he owns. His house reeks of oil. Every item in the house is contaminated. And, Mr. Speaker, more than Mr. Martin, there are 5 affected families who all worry that the $50,000 limit won't cover the costs of the significant damages to their homes. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the minister for his personal assurance that these people will be provided with enough disaster relief to cover the true costs of cleanup and damage.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to advise the member and all members of the House that the Department of Environment are doing environmental testing in all of the affected areas in Nova Scotia, and we are waiting for those reports. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is a question about the amount of disaster relief that is available. Mr. Speaker, the cost of cleaning up an oil spill can run well over $100,000, even $150,000. It is unlikely that $50,000 will cover the damage that has been done to these people's homes. Surely the minister agrees that these families don't deserve to face financial ruin simply because they were unlucky enough to be struck by a flood. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is this. What exactly are you going to do to ensure that these people get adequate disaster relief, and when are you going to do it?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are awaiting the results, as I indicated, of the environmental testing throughout Nova Scotia in those areas where there is oil damage and apparent oil damage. Once we get those results, the government and its committee will review all of those claims and take the appropriate action to ensure that all Nova Scotians are protected against the results of this disaster. Thank you very much.
Now, member of Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. For almost 2 years, this government has refused to provide the parents in Barrington Passage with an answer about their sick school. Gail and Leighton Goodwin have told my office that their 14-year-old son, Tyrell, that Barrington Municipal High School has made him seriously ill. In the summer, this young man was healthy. In September, Tyrell started getting headaches, a sore throat, and various other symptoms. In March, Gail Goodwin requested a transfer to Drumlin Heights. The Goodwin's family doctor says a change of environment would be good for her son, but he has been refused. Last month, Tyrell came home spitting up blood from a severe infection. Tyrell's mom says under no circumstances will her son return to Barrington Municipal School. Mr. Minister, what are you going to do to help the Goodwin family?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we continue to evaluate the situation at Barrington, and we have received recent reports that doctors who are involved in doing the evaluation have requested that they be given some time to do additional reports or additional studies, and we're awaiting those reports. And I can tell the honourable member that we continue to monitor the situation very carefully.
The honourable member Timberley Prospect on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, according to parent Marilee Ross, 25 students have already transferred out of Barrington Municipal. 6 more students, however, have been denied transfer to Drumlin Heights. These parents, incidentally, have contacted a lawyer. They're planning to take this government on about this issue. They're trying, however, to get straight answers from the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, parents recently received a copy of a memo from Dennis Cochran, the Deputy Minister of Education, to this minister, and I'm going to table it. The memo acknowledges that there is a problem at the school, but it calls for further study. Minister, is it the plan of your department to continue to study this school while these young people get sicker and sicker?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member can appreciate that whatever action is taken to correct the situation that exists at Barrington or to identify the situation at Barrington cannot be determined overnight, and it requires considerable analysis, and we will make our decisions based on the analysis that are provided to us. And when we feel that we're in a position to make a decision with respect to the future of that facility, Mr. Speaker, we will be making the decision.
The honourable member Kimberley Prospect on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Barrington Passage parents do not deserve to send their children to a sick school. A year ago, I stood in this House and asked the same questions without referring to young Tyrell Goodwin. I have been to that school, Mr. Minister. Your deputy minister took a whirlwind trip, made a report, and nothing has been done. Absolutely nothing has been done. What can the people of Barrington Municipal School expect? What am I? What is your advice to me as the education critic for the official opposition when I return this phone call tonight to Tyrell Goodwin and his family? What do you suggest I say to her?
Please, the honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I have also visited the school, and I met with officials of the school board. I met with members of the staff. I met with municipal leaders and other concerned citizens in that community. And I outlined on that occasion the proposed course of action which we intended to follow with respect to coming to a conclusion on the future of the school. And, Mr. Speaker, we are following through on that committed course of action.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on April 28, 2001, the Premier gave a speech to the Construction Management Bureau in which he was talking about the yearly interest paid on our debt. In the speech, the Premier said of the debt servicing charges, quote, "That's more than we spend on public school education. It doesn't buy one textbook, it doesn't pay one teacher, and it doesn't help to heat or light a single school," end quote. Speaker, the Premier went on to further say, quote, "We are going to balance the budget in 3 years and begin reducing the debt and capturing those lost dollars in interest for Nova Scotians," end quote. Mr. Speaker, under this Premier's leadership and over the course of the next 3 budgets, this government is today projecting that it will pay an additional $367 million in interest on the debt of this province. My question to the Premier: why has the Premier failed to live up to his commitment to begin spending these yearly interest dollars on programs and services instead of increasing the amount of Nova Scotians' money that goes to banks?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The challenges that this government faced back in 1999 were considerable. From 1993 to 1999, $3.6 billion was added to the provincial debt. 1/3 of the provincial debt was added in 6 years. The first step was to balance the budget, which was clearly one of the commitments we made, and we said we would do it in the year that we did it. That was number one. Number two, we said we would reduce the exposure of foreign currency in our debt, and we have reduced it from 51% to 20%. We indicated that surpluses would go to the debt, and the Minister of Finance was able to articulate that recently when he announced that the surplus for last year was in fact going to the debt. It was $14.5 million. We also, Mr. Speaker, would reduce the debt to the GDP, and we reduced that by over 46% down to 42%. It will go down to 41% this year. The fifth commitment we made was we would then, once we achieved all of these things, would provide a calendar as to when we would in fact balance the amortization of debt and the expenditure on amortized costs. That will be our fifth commitment, and it will be kept prior to us finishing this mandate.
For Richmond on your first supplementary.
Mr. Premier, it's ironic that the word for word, the advice to Premier from Mr. Batterson is exactly what the Premier gave us here, rather than the open and honest, accountable government he told us he would give us. Mr. Speaker, this is the Premier that in 1999 said, I can do all of the commitments that he listed, and I can do it without having to borrow 1 cent. That is what this Premier said. Mr. Speaker, his failure to live up to this commitment will have implications for generations to come. The $367 million in debt services is enough to hire an additional 6,000 nurses, is enough to pay for 6,500 teachers, and enough to pay for 840,000 new textbooks for our schools. Mr. Speaker, the Premier also said, quote, if you want to protect education, and I don't mean just for today, but for tomorrow and the foreseeable future, then we have to start to recapture that $900 million so it can be put back into education and other priorities, end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, under this Premier's leadership, next year, the yearly debt servicing interest cost will be $1 billion under this Tory administration. Mr. Speaker, that's $1 billion of Nova Scotians' money that's going to banks instead of programs and services. I asked the Premier, why won't you simply admit that the Premier was not being upfront to Nova Scotians when he said he would not borrow money and that he would reduce debt servicing charges the minute he got elected?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it must be awfully discouraging to the members of that caucus when they look at what we promised to do in 1999, as written in the Blue Book, and we have followed to the letter the Blue Book, and we continue to follow the Blue Book. And, Mr. Speaker, we are going to deliver the Blue Book, and if the electorate is willing, we'll deliver Blue Book 2 as well.
The honourable member for Richmond on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, more and more the veil is being lifted, as I've said, and Nova Scotians are seeing the real face behind this Premier and is smiling back at them and spending our money with no end in sight. Mr. Speaker, that additional $367 million in debt servicing costs would be enough to twin the 104 highway from New Glasgow to Sydney without having to rely on 1 cent from Ottawa and without having to add 1 cent to our debt. It would be enough to fix the decaying bridges in this province. Mr. Speaker, this Premier, who made such commitments in 1999, is continuing to put the future of our children and generations to come at risk because there's no end to the borrowing in sight. My final supplementary is, why is this Premier, who preached and made so many commitments in 1999 that he has failed to live up to, continuing to jeopardize the future by failing to deal today with a debt so that we don't have to send $1 billion to the bank tomorrow?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if the member opposite would do a little bit of mathematics, if we hadn't increased the debt of this province $3.6 billion from 1993 to 1999, we wouldn't have to send $1 billion to the bank. We'd have to send less than $700 million to the bank. We would have a $300 million surplus if, from 1993 to 1999, the debt had not increased $3.6 billion.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, seniors and other residents in long-term care have not had an increase in their monthly $105 personal allowance for at least 10 years. This allowance set by the Minister of Health is used by residents for phone services, toiletries, haircuts, clothing, small things they need, Mr. Speaker. One of the options the Minister of Health had when she recently scrambled to try to make up a plan for long-term care was to increase this allowance. I want to ask the Minister to explain why she chose to continue to put the squeeze on seniors and nursing home residents by freezing this meager allowance.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member opposite that allowance is something that has to be dealt with. But Mr. Speaker, we are proceeding with a stepwise plan to reduce the medical costs of people in nursing homes, and at the end of our 4-year plan, we will have a new system in place, and that system will help all the residents of the nursing homes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
I think she said we'll look at it in 2008.
Au contraire, Mr. Speaker. Seniors have been waiting for a long time for an increase in this allowance, and 14 years is way too long, Mr. Speaker. Nursing home staff have told us that many seniors in these homes must rely on family to provide toiletry items, clothing, and personal needs. Those who don't have family do without, or they rely on the kindness of these nursing home staff. I want to ask the Minister of Health, instead of using Romano money for Tory tax cuts, why didn't you use the infusion of health care dollars to help those who need it more by giving an increase to this allowance?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there are many issues that affect seniors that need to be addressed. There are many issues in the whole health care system and across other systems in the province that need to be addressed. But one thing the member opposite continually fails to understand is that we have to be able to pay for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, staff in continuing care facilities are collecting refundable bottles and using the proceeds to buy toiletry items for seniors who would otherwise go without basic supplies like tissues and hand cream. Instead of addressing this problem, the minister and her government are putting Romano money into Tory tax cuts, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask the Minister of Health, how can your government justify attempting to buy the goodwill of Nova Scotian voters when there are seniors in nursing homes who can't even afford a box of Kleenex?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are well aware of many of the issues with seniors. That is why we're putting more money this year into nursing home costs. It's why we are freezing pharmacare premiums. Indeed, we are making a substantial investment to help all seniors this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, restorative justice has been a part of the legal system in Nova Scotia now for a few years. But today, we heard from several women's groups about how restorative justice has had a negative impact on women who are victims of sexual assault or violence. Restorative justice requires the victim and the abuser to have to confront each other as a means of the abuser not going to court, Mr. Speaker. The independent report issued today noted that women have shock and fear, quote unquote, in having to use this process to sentence an abuser. Now, however, there is currently a self-imposed moratorium by the Department of Justice on these crimes going through restorative justice. But my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Justice, is the minister prepared to admit that sexual assault and violence crimes against women should not be part of restorative justice process and that the moratorium be imposed on a permanent basis?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, quite frank, the study that he's quoting from, we haven't seen that, to be honest, and we'll judge the study when we see it. But the fact is, as the honourable member said, this is not an issue in Nova Scotia right now because there is a moratorium and violent crime, sexual assault, restorative justice process is not part of that.
Honourable Member Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is that there are many women in this province that are fearful that that moratorium will not be permanent, but is only temporary, and that they will be forced to use this system if they are victims of violence or sexual assault, Mr. Speaker. In particular, also, Mr. Speaker, women's groups are very nervous about that moratorium being lifted, and that because of the impact on them. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, groups like the Avalon Sexual Assault Center and the women's centers in this province have already had a bad hand dealt to them by this government, Mr. Speaker, and they're worried that if that moratorium is lifted and these crimes are again put into the restorative justice system as is proposed by this government, that it will be unbearable on those centers, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Justice is, will he ensure that groups like Avalon Sexual Assault Center, FANS, and women's centers in this province will be part of discussions for a permanent decision and process with regard to restorative justice to ensure that victims of abuse and violence are at the table negotiating a permanent solution?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is trying to make an issue out of something that currently doesn't exist in Nova Scotia in terms of that, because those violent and sexual assaults, restorative justice process does not apply to them. This department has consulted with women's groups for many years and will continue to do so in the future.
The Honourable Member Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on your final supplementary.
Speaker, since the minister says he doesn't have a copy, I'll table a copy of the report. And there are specific quotes from very many women in this province who have fear about the system as it currently stands. And one of the key recommendations of this report, Mr. Speaker, is that the current restorative justice system is not workable for victims of violence and sexual assault. That's the bottom line of the report, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Justice is the Minister of Justice committed to ensuring on a permanent basis that this current restorative justice system will not be used for sexual assault and violent crimes against women, and that a new system will be developed to protect the victims of violence?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member may know when the restorative justice program was thought about here in Nova Scotia, there was some suggestion that referrals of sexual abuse and spousal abuse were contemplated. That's never been the case here in Nova Scotia, and it was going to be after sentencing, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to work with women's groups. Right now, it's not an issue, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't exist in this province, and we have no intention at the current time of changing the present system. I mean, that's I think what he's trying to do is get on another bandwagon, Mr. Speaker. Fear-mongering, absolutely.
Order, please. Member Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for...
Order, please. Order, please. Member Clare has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Tory government has been proudly advertising the $155 rebate for Nova Scotians, the 21st century rum bottle. But, Mr. Speaker, this government is showing its contempt for many Nova Scotians who have worked hard all their lives but who have suffered disability or other setback. And my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is why his government feels some taxpayers are more important than others.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government came to office determined that throughout the course of its mandate, all Nova Scotians would benefit from our policies. I believe taxpayers deserve help. I believe minimum wage earners need help, and we delivered that help today. I believe children needed help, and that's why we participated in the National Child Benefit with the federal government, providing children not only on community services programs, but in low-income family, a guaranteed payment for government.
The Honourable Member Clare on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, with his permission, I'll table that, please. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, with his permission, I refer to a copy of an email that was sent to the Premier from Michael Paxton Coe of Digby. He's on a disability pension, and his wife has a CPP retirement pension. Together, they make less than $15,000. He asked, and I quote, "What happens to people that don't earn enough to pay taxes?" End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I understand that Mr. Paxton Coe hasn't received an answer from the Premier to that question. Perhaps we can get an answer for him today. And my question to the Premier, what happens to people that don't earn enough to pay taxes?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the programs of which this government is very proud is our Educate to Work program, which is part of our community services programming. And as a result of providing the appropriate supports for those on income assistance on community services, as of today, 9,000 Nova Scotians, many of whom have families, are no longer receiving community services programs, but are actively engaged in the workforce. Mr. Speaker, our government programs are designed to allow people to escape the very situations that the member opposite describes.
The Honourable Member Clare, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows that these individuals don't qualify for assistance from community services. He knows that. Mr. Speaker, my final question to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we've received other letters from Nova Scotians who have worked and paid income tax for most of their lives. Now, when they've had some misfortune and are struggling to pay higher costs on a severely reduced income, their government turns its back on them. That same government, Mr. Speaker, has been taking its sales tax windfall on higher insurance and on fuel costs. And my final question to the Premier, when will you acknowledge that low-income Nova Scotians deserve a share of your windfall and find a way to ensure that they too get some meaningful relief from the brutally high costs they've suffered to keep warm this past winter?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Nova Scotians know that working families need a tax break. And I think because gradually Nova Scotians are becoming acquainted with the tax relief that this government is going to provide them, because of the initiative of this government, 3,500 low-income Nova Scotians that used to pay tax, because of the changes that we have made, will pay no tax.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Stop yelling, Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth North has the floor.
Here. Come on, Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and this is a very important question. Mr. Speaker, today, the workers at group homes operated by the Regional Residential Services Society has gone on strike. They are asking that the disparity be addressed between their wages and those of workers doing the same job in institutional settings. So far, the Minister of Community Services has refused to step in and help resolve this situation. I asked the Minister, how could you force these workers into taking job action for such a reasonable request?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for his question, and indeed the workers have commenced job action effective 7:30 this morning, and I regret they felt that they needed to make that decision, Mr. Speaker, because I think a lot of the members there are very caring people that indeed are interested in the interests of the residents. And Mr. Speaker, I share that concern, as does the service provider, that being Regional Residential Services Society, which in fact provides the service and the care to those residents, which is funded by community services. We fund the sector, Mr. Speaker. We do not negotiate with individual service providers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is quite right. He does fund the service sector. But if he puts more money on the table, I'm sure that their negotiations will begin tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, these workers didn't want to take job action, but they cannot continue to work for $5 an hour less than their counterparts in institutional settings. It wasn't too long ago, Mr. Speaker, that these very same workers were expected to be happily with living below the poverty line to work in highly demanding jobs that require a high level of training. They are asking for what is fair and nothing more. Right. How can the Minister of Community Services look these families in the eye, and he says, as he has done all he can, when the department won't even come to the bargaining table in good faith? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for his question, and it's interesting that he would suggest that the department would come to the bargaining table when we're not part of the negotiations. Mr. Speaker, I would refer back to some of my earlier comments on this. 4 years ago, we worked with this sector, Mr. Speaker. We worked to create a vision of what is the appropriate level of care for those residents. And with the sector, we came up with a higher standards. We put it geographically across the province. There's geographical pay equity, Mr. Speaker. The wages were increased from as low as $6 an hour in some cases and are now $13.70 an hour. Substantial new funds have been put towards the care of the residents in that sector, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Now, member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind the minister that his department and he are the ghost at the table. They are the ones who pull the string here. Mr. Speaker, the Community Services has allowed families to be pressured to take residents home, or they would be put in an institutional setting, causing great distress. If the families could care for these loved ones at home, they wouldn't be in the residential program in the first place. My question to the minister is, how long is the Minister of Community Services prepared to sit back and allow this situation to deteriorate before he lives up to his responsibility to those vulnerable residents and their families?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services. Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member opposite giving me the chance to assure the residents, their families, Nova Scotians, as I have done personally and through the House, that we are doing all that we can to minimize the disruption to the residents. In fact, Mr. Speaker, of 178 residents that are affected by this, 151 are either with their families, remain in the same facilities, or supervised apartments. Yes, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, 27 have been taken into a nurse's residence, which is not an institutional setting, and I personally have gone out there to get the assurance that they are properly being cared for by the RRSS with their contingency plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, Bill 68 saw the loss of almost 1,200 nurses in Nova Scotia, which we've never recovered from. District health authorities currently cannot fill positions, and hospitals...
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will start again, if your permission. Bill 68 saw the losses of almost 1,200 licensed nurses in Nova Scotia, and we've never recovered. District health authorities can't fill nursing positions, and hospitals are forced to cancel surgeries because there are not enough nurses to cover operating rooms. Yet this Minister of Health still claims that her government's nursing strategy is working for Nova Scotians. My question to the Minister, if the nursing strategy is working, why are there less nurses, unfilled nursing positions, and canceled surgery, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the nursing strategy is working, Mr. Speaker. We are seeing an improvement in our retention of nurses, and we are causing seats to be opened up in the nursing schools. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that part of the reason we have a problem in the first place, Mr. Speaker, is a government that paid nurses to leave and cut the seats in the nursing schools. Thank you.
The member, order, please. Order, please. Honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
I don't care what language she's speaking. I'm not going to take the bait this time. Because, Mr. Speaker, we know that many nurses will soon be retiring, and they will need to be replaced. Now, Mr. Speaker, this minister has told us that many nursing graduates don't find work in Nova Scotia because there are limited positions for them because they are new graduates. Yet the minister claims her government's nursing strategy is working for Nova Scotians and for nurses. My question to the minister, how are new graduates going to get the experience they need to replace retiring nurses and stay in Nova Scotia when this government tells them that there are no positions for them?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I noted with interest an article in today's Chronicle Herald by the nurse recruiter for the QE2 entitled Capital Health Welcomes New Nurses, in which it explains how one DHA is hiring new nurse recruits and has jobs for nurses. And Mr. Speaker, I will table that document for the member opposite's enlightenment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
1,199 nurses working less.
I read that article as well, and I think it's a good article, but it still begs the question. There are less nurses working in Nova Scotia today than there were in 1999. So that's the issue. Mr. Speaker, in my final supplement,
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor in his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to recap, essentially, quickly, we have less nurses, we have more unfilled nurse positions, we have canceled surgeries, we have recent graduates that are not qualifying for the jobs, and that's the issue, and that's the issue in the article as well. Nurses are overworked. We have a crisis in nursing, and we have a nursing crisis. And we are told yet to believe that this nursing strategy of this government is working. My question,
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Now, member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary, please.
Question, yes. How, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister simply is, how can she stand in this House and say that her government's nursing strategy is working when Nova Scotia's nurses of tomorrow, the recent graduates, are being told not to bother to apply?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, if he had read that article, he would know that graduates are not being told any such thing. Mr. Speaker, our nursing strategy is working. It's working because it is not the government's strategy. It is the strategy of nurses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Premier, according to the Department of Finance's own figures, the top 5% of income earners in Nova Scotia are going to get 40% of the tax cut. Why is that fair?
The honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Finance.
The honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite asked for information from staff and it was forwarded to him. And it doesn't come as a surprise, Mr. Speaker, that the people who are in the high income bracket obviously will get a higher percentage. Because, Mr. Speaker, income tax is a progressive tax. I'm sorry. If I misspoke, I apologize, Mr. Speaker. The people who make more also pay more taxes, Mr. Speaker, because the income tax is a progressive tax. And, Mr. Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. We expected that, and what we have put in place is exactly what people expected.
Now, member for Halifax Fairview, and your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that Premier and that Minister don't understand the reality of today's families. The reality of today's families is that the HST in a full tank of heating oil is $60 or more. You pay the same amount whether your income is $10,000 or $100,000. My question to the Premier, according to the Department of Finance's figures, Nova Scotians with annual incomes under $30,000, which is 72% of the total, will get 18% of the tax cut. Why is that fair?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Finance.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite speak about the member in the lower bracket, Mr. Speaker. And the fact of the matter, in this budget, 3,500 people who are in the lower income will not pay any income tax whatsoever when they used to. But the other thing, Mr. Speaker, that we should also point out, as of the income tax cuts that we put in place, the highest percentage was in the lower brackets, Mr. Speaker. And the changes that we have been putting in place are to continue our economy to grow. That is something that the NDP failed to recognize. That is why they've never been recognized as a party in the
Order,
past.
please. Order, please. Time for a question period has expired. The honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to introduce in the West Gallery, joining us today is Vince Hall. He's a councillor with the CBRM, and I understand he's here to watch the proceedings. And I understand that according to the member from Cape Breton Nova, Mr. Hall is apparently a well-known cat wrangler. Now, I don't know what that is, but I understand it's supposed to be a compliment. So I don't know what he's going to learn here today, but certainly we welcome him, and I...
Certainly welcome Mr. Hall to the gallery today. Government business, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move that you do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself into a committee of the whole House on supply unto Her Majesty.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in my place today, Mr. Speaker, to say a few words about my constituency before we go into supply, and a few things about the a ministerial statement today around minimum wage. But first, Mr. Speaker, let me say that, you know, these are indeed hard times for a lot of Nova Scotians. And indeed, they're extremely hard times for the people that I represent in the riding of Cape Breton Centre, Mr. Speaker. Because, you know, we, like probably no other communities have been suffered massive hits of unemployment. And unemployment's not because that the industries they were involved with had died a natural death through the economy and there was nothing there to replace those jobs, Mr. Speaker. No, almost to a person, all those job losses were the direct result of government intervention into the economy and taking those jobs out of there, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I speak of the coal industry and the steel industry, where these were well-paying jobs, and for years, jobs that had built this very province, jobs that, you know, that certainly helped us win 2 world wars, jobs that really changed the face of this whole province, that brought us into an age of an industrialization that we finally got around to respecting the workers in some small degree by their fight and their struggle for unionization, Mr. Speaker. And that brings me around, excuse me, to some of today's topics, because the Minister of Environment and Labour came forward with a document today with regards to raising the minimum wage, and to much ballyhoo from his backbenchers in their undying support for their position. Well, you know, if we're really, really serious about protecting people on the lower echelon of the wage structure in this province, Mr. Speaker, there's more to it than 25 cents an hour. Now, while I personally, and I believe my party will support this going forward as somewhat of a progressive measure, still does not answer the overall question of what they're going to do about the Labour Standards Code. Because as long as the Labour Standards Code goes unresolved or unedited, if you will, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have problems here. Because these people really have no protection in the workforce. I mean, there is a code there that says you can do this, this, and this, but the accessibility for those workers, the unorganized workers in this province, is extremely difficult. Now, Mr. Speaker, if this government was serious about bringing these workers forward, they would have done a couple of things. First of all, would have made how the minimum wage is struck a more open process. It would have tied it to a process with the consumer price index so they could grow automatically. They would have done something that nearly all industrialized economies have, and that's a 40-hour work week. I mean, you know, we see an election going on in the province of Quebec today, where that province is talking about going to a 4-day work week to protect workers and recognize the pressures put on workers and today's families, Mr. Speaker. But this government, in a pre-budget flurry, is going to tell Nova Scotians that we're going to give you 25 cents in October, and a year from today, or a year from now, give you another 25 cents. It still makes us the 3rd lowest minimum wage in the country. We're still just the only province as we sit now that we're above in Atlantic Canada is Prince Edward Island. So it's not the windfall that these workers can expect. Who are these workers, I think, should be a more relevant question also, Mr. Speaker. And these people are primarily household leaders of a single-parent family. These people have to work more hours, more days, be away from their families longer to earn a decent wage. And by the mere fact of what we call this, the minimum wage, says more about where governments have thought about this in the past than really what we should. Because this should be certainly put forward not as the minimum wage, if we were serious about protecting workers' rights in this province, but it would be put forward as a living wage, What is a living wage? How can these people making below $7 an hour really participate in the economy of this province? How much spending power does $7 an hour give you? When we see in the winter serious spikes in home heating costs and the related HST to that, Mr. Speaker, we've seen that. We see unrestricted rent increases in major cities in this province, Mr. Speaker. How does that reconcile? How does the government reconcile its increase with the real increase in the standard or in the cost of living, Mr. Speaker? Because these people are falling further and further behind. These are people that will not be getting the infamous $150 check, $55 check this June, Mr. Speaker. These people will not be participating in any tax reduction to Nova Scotians because they don't pay taxes, because they don't make enough, Mr. Speaker. These are people, unlike the higher end, as my colleague from Halifax Fairview had pointed out earlier, who are participating in this tax windfall. These are people who would love to participate in that sector. But there's nothing there for them, Mr. Speaker. We have to come to this province with the realization that we need real changes in the Labour Standards Code, Mr. Speaker. We need changes that today's families can use so they can grow with the rest of the economy, Mr. Speaker. That they can go out and buy the goods and services and be able to stand side by side with their neighbours and take advantages of the many wealth that this province should offer them. But no, Mr. Speaker, we continually take the aspect that what you do is you keep the heavy thumb of government on them. This government, for years and years, between the Liberals and Tories, have used the low wages of many Nova Scotians as a way to attract business to this very province, Mr. Speaker. I remember when the Liberals sat over there, one of the things on their economic development site was almost advertising Nova Scotia as Mexico North when it came to minimum wages. And they were quite proud of that the wages were so low. Well, Mr. Speaker, as opposed to something to be proud of, I believe it's something they should be ashamed of, to go around telling people that our wages are at or near Mexico's. You know, we've seen reports come to this very government that's in power now about the amount of adult illiteracy in this province and how that affects our overall job performance. But yet the government doesn't do anything there to help them, Mr. Speaker. It takes that report, puts it on a shelf, and allows it to gather dust. You know, today we heard a resolution from the member from Halifax Atlantic talking about GED and adult learning in J.L. Isley School, Mr. Speaker. Another program cut by this government. But yet they come in the dying days of their own government and flip a quarter at the minimum wage earners in this province and say, there, that's enough. That's all you need. You know, you don't need any more, and you don't need any protection. You don't need any protection from employers who use and abuse these people, who have very little rights. We have a government that we have a trade union act that's over a quarter of a century old, that this government will not, through Labour Minister after Labour Minister, will not look at and try to update to bring it in fact. That it will not give workers the rights to organize in a meaningful way. That workers will not be allowed automatic certification, as it's done in many other provinces and in the federal jurisdiction in this country. No, this government wants to put up roadblocks to organized labor, for workers to be able to say collectively that's not right. We see a strike happening in this capital region today, Mr. Speaker, where a government who is the ghost at the table, who has the money and will not go in and be a real player at that table. But yet, we have a government that condones scab workers. We have a government that will not look at reality of labor peace. We have a government that will help prolong that labor disruption because it doesn't have the proper legislation in place. If there was legislation in place to outlaw replacement scab workers, we would have a quick resolve to that work stoppage, Mr. Speaker, and a fair resolve. But yet we have a government that hides behind the fact that they're not at the table. Well, Mr. Speaker, they should be, because the contradiction coming from the minister today was fairly loud, Mr. Speaker, where he said one time where he was taking great umbrage that he was the guy that got involved and upped the wages for everybody. But when it comes to collective bargaining, he has no role in it. Well, you can't be one way or the other, Mr. Speaker. You have to be down the middle. And what he should have said, he did it before. He will get to the table and help these workers. These workers, Mr. Speaker, are looking for a just wage. They're looking for a wage that's comparative in their industry. Yet it's a government here and previous governments before it are void of giving workers any substantive right or say in the workplace. You know, we hear much about, these kind of half-hearted thank yous to workers in this province. But when it comes right down to protecting the workers' rights, whether it be through the Labour Standards Code or the Trade Union Act, all of these little platitudes fall short. Workers in this province, since time of Confederation, have been used as pawns. In the 1925 strike, when Liberal leadership sent the provincial police into New Waterford and shot and killed William Davis, we have seen oppressive governments work against the workers in this province. When will these governments ever come to be and rely on workers as an equal partner in the economy of Nova Scotia? When will workers in this province be respected for what they have done for this province, instead of abused time and time again, Mr. Speaker? When will governments truly say that we are thankful for what you have done, how you've built this economy, how you've helped Nova Scotians, what you've done for the economy of Cape Breton, what you've done for the economy of Halifax, Yarmouth, Pictou County, all these, the fishers, of all the people in this Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Everybody should be aware of what workers have done, and instead of these kind of half-hearted platitudes from time again, let's put some real teeth in this. Let's allow workers to have their rightful place. Let's respect them. Let's give the ones that do not want to be organized decent coverage around the